and I'll pay attention to the waiting room while we go and let folks in as they come. Good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us. This is our once a month Woods Wise webinar with Commissioner Michael Snyder. We are really glad to have him here. I'm so thrilled he's willing to do this, even with all the work that's on his plate these days. I'm very grateful, Mike, that you do this for us, because I know you are a busy man. And but I also know you love to talk to people, so I hope we give you a little pleasure in return with conversation and questions. So folks, don't hesitate about your questions, put them in the chat box. And with smaller groups, we sometimes can take those questions with hand raises too. But what we're going to do tonight is read 3 chapters from the book, from Woods Wise. And Mike, I think we are on chapter 15.
Sounds good. That's my understanding.
Yep. So why don't you take it away?
Okay. Well, thank you, Kathleen. Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to join you once again for another reading from Woods Wise, an exploration of forests and forestry. Thanks to Vermont Woodlands Association for hosting and pulling these together. As I say each time, it's a monthly occurrence, and it's a real, I get just really tickled, I guess I keep saying, that folks would want to spend some time, with the book, for the reading, and then some questions and discussion. With each passing day, I feel I'm out of the woods. I miss the woods, and feeling rustier and rustier. I hope you're all staying engaged in the woods. I did get out a little bit here and there, and through this spring, and I guess I just hope everybody's having a good spring, good enough, and that you're feeling well and happy, and better days ahead. So I'll dive in here. We again, working our way through, by way of reminder for, I don't know if there's anyone who's just here, we're reading from Woods Wise, a collection of essays I wrote over a prolonged period of time for Northern Woodlands magazine, addressing, if not answering, questions that had arisen over time, usually generated by walks in the woods with private landowners. So this next question I attempt to address begins like this. Why are some trees pollinated by wind and some by insects? Pollen is to trees what sperm is to animals. It carries the tree's male genes. It is the male fertilizing unit of woody plant reproduction. Typically, pollen appears in spring as a powdery cloud of fine yellowish grains. Each tiny grain is a single cell encased in a tough, rigid, or spiked coating. When inhaled by susceptible people, these grains can cause nasty allergic reactions, but they are absolutely essential for the continuing life cycle and evolution of trees. Pollination is the movement of these pollen grains from the male reproductive part of a plant to the female reproductive part. It is a prerequisite to fertilization, which occurs when the sperm-making pollen is united with the egg-containing ovary of a plant of the same species. If all goes well, the making of pollen, the subsequent act of pollination, and the biological marvel of fertilization all lead to the growth of fruits and seeds. This is a very good deal. Not only is it the basis for agricultural food production for human needs, it also perpetuates trees and determines the composition of forests. Pollen is key. While fortuitous accidents do happen, and some trees get lucky, most trees need a bit of help from wind or animals to get their pollen from one flower to another. Globally, the incidence of wind pollination increases with both latitude and elevation. It is most common in temperate, deciduous, and boreal forests, but extremely uncommon in tropical rainforests. There, animal-aided pollination, especially by insects, is much more common. Wind pollination is most effective where wind is likely to be an advantage in open habitats and in early successional ecosystems. Indeed, it is common among forest trees that reach canopy height and whose flowers or cones are exposed to winds, but almost non-existent among understory plants, which live in less wind-prone conditions. Nearly all of our common conifers, including pines, spruces, and firs, rely on wind pollination, and so do many broadleaf trees, including aspens, cottonwoods, oaks, ashes, elms, birches, and walnuts. These hardwoods all share a common male flower form. They tend to occur in elongate, drooping catkins, well positioned for wind dissemination. Many of them, most famously the aspens, oaks, and ashes, avoid interference from leaves by forming flowers and shedding their pollen well before leaf out. But relying on the vagaries of wind and weather to deliver pollen is arguably something of a crapshoot. Consequently, trees gambling on such a risky mode of pollination seem to hedge their bets by producing enormous amounts of pollen, 10 million grains from one cluster of birch catkins, for example. That's billions of pollen grains from a single tree. And while at times it may seem as if most of them are in your lungs and the rest are on your car, at least some of that pollen actually finds the intended female flower pods. While this throw pollen to the wind strategy may be effective in stands with many individuals of the same species growing near each other, it does have its shortcomings, particularly in mixed species stands and in fragmented landscapes. Although some pollen can travel great distances, it doesn't remain viable for very long, and most airborne pollen comes to rest close to the tree that produced it. Thus, it is not as effective at delivering pollen to distant trees. Moreover, it is very expensive energetically for the parent tree to produce such large quantities and seems wasteful when so much pollen never reaches its intended target. By contrast, trees that rely on pollination by animals, chiefly insects, but also birds and bats, tend to produce far less pollen in any given flowering period because pollination is far more direct and efficient. The animal transported pollen also tends to be slightly sticky, less dust-like, and produced later when the leaves are forming. This approach seems to work better among widely spaced individuals. Native non-wind pollinated species are few. Among the best known are insect pollinated trees are apple, basswood, cherries, black locust, catalpa, horse chestnut, tulip tree, and the willows. As logic would have it, species that rely on insects, mostly bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths, birds and bats tend to have fragrant, sometimes stinky, large or otherwise showy flowers. Attracting insects that might carry pollen from one tree to another tends to facilitate an outcrossing mode of reproduction. This carries weighty implications for genetic variation and flexibility, which in turn allows species to cope with varied habitats and changing growing conditions over time. It is also good to remember that most insect pollinators do this important work when they are adults, even if some of them can be voracious defoliators during their earlier immature life stages. All that's playing out before us right now out there in sort of prolonged spraying. And isn't it fun to be able to see these different textures of the canopy, even from a distance? And then you bore in and you look at those and you realize it's different stages of development, and within a species and across species, they have different approaches to, kind of waking up from a winter dormancy and emerging for new growth in the spring, including reproductive growth. And all these different patterns, different colors, it's really fascinating. And my only complaint is it goes way too fast. Suddenly it's this great green mass out there, and we're into the next one. I wish the Vermont spring would just extend a little bit. Maybe I'd pick up a few more things along the way.
So are there trees that depend on both wind and insects?
Well, it's a natural question. I don't know right off like a direct answer of yes, this one or that one. I suspect it happens where, somewhat accidental in one case or the other. I can't imagine why it wouldn't. But depend on, not sure about that.
Yeah, I guess that word makes it a little different question than does it happen? Right. Yes. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Folks, if you have questions, feel free to just ask those questions if it's easier than putting them in the chat box. Here we go. So in order to get from Eleanor a new maple tree, how does pollination make that new tree?
Well, it's again, the pollen part of this is the male part that is, and then as long as it's in through this sexual reproduction, as opposed to a vegetative reproduction, then you introduce variation and crossing that parlays that forward. And that's how, over time, you get kind of a new, you get new combinations, which have potentially new or different outward expressions of some trait that's noticeable. And you can say, well, that's new compared to that one. And that comes about through this genetic recombination of that's afforded by the male of one joining with the female of another.
And also from Eleanor, so then the pollen hits the ground and a new tree grows?
No, the pollen, if the pollen hits the ground, it becomes just recycled organic material. It has to land on its target to have any effect, which is to land on the female reproductive part of the same species. And so that's the sort of crapshoot element of this is they put off, wind pollinated species in particular, put off an awful lot of a lot of it, clouds of it, kind of randomly hoping it'll intercept with, the right target. The rest of it is wasted, if you will.
Right.
So if it hits the ground, it's when a seed hits the ground that the tree magic can begin. So if the pollen is helping to make, when joining with the appropriate female part, it leads to fertilization of the fruit, which contains the seeds, and then those would be disseminated. And when that seed hits the ground, with luck, it germinates, it sends a little root into the ground, little shoots above, and off it goes. The pollen is a part of the story as a precursor to that.
Right. So you need the seed.
Ultimately, you need the seed to get the tree. Yep.
Yep. So from Mike Dwayne, what were the bright red flowers on the dirt roads about 2 weeks ago? Beech.
I would think
Red maple.
those would most likely be the red maple, which is certainly well named. At every season of the year, every growth stage, there's something very red about that tree. And that's the springtime. You can see those big red buds have expanded, and now you have flowers, red, before the leaves emerge with their red stems. It's I would guess those would be the red maples, also known as soft maples.
Other questions?
Happy to take them if I can.
Yep. Yep. And Michael is not a stickler about the topic.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I mean,
Yeah.
The Spanish Civil War, I don't know so much about that. I mean, I'll do my best. But
Well, forestry.
Yeah.
I meant not this pollination topic. But if you had another question, he would not ignore it. So if there are no other questions, we will move on to the next chapter.
Okay, I'll move along. Another kind of seasonally appropriate one here. Really one of my favorite activities, and I think I remember really enjoying trying to write this essay to really kind of boil it down. One of the most pure and important and good things you can do. Maybe can I boil it down to its essence in 750 words? So here it is. What's the best way to transplant wild-grown trees? Green side up, brown side down is a good start. And it's testimony to the toughness of trees that such simple advice will take you surprisingly far. You can dig a sapling out of the woods, drag it to a new location, stuff it in the ground, and it may actually live. sometimes. The tree's chances for survival and growth, however, increase dramatically with a bit more understanding and finesse. No, it's not a kidney transplant, but it pays to carefully evaluate the tree to be transplanted, the new site, the timing of the move, and your handling of the transplant. Choose a healthy, vigorous tree to transplant. Resist the temptation to rescue some struggling sapling. Transplanting is stressful enough. Stronger plants will be more successful. Bear in mind, too, that larger trees are generally more difficult to transplant than smaller trees. Pick a tree that will grow well in its new location. Not every species is suitable for every site, so select a native tree that's well adapted to your area and try to plant it in soil and light conditions similar to those where it was growing. Don't expect to bring a tree home to New England from your in-laws' lawn in Florida, and be realistic when moving a tree from a shady, moist woods to an open, dry yard. Once you've settled on the tree to move and the place to plant it, consider the timing of the move. Your best bet is in early spring after the soil warms and before bud break. This provides good opportunity for the transplant to reestablish its root system. But you can safely transplant trees anytime they're dormant, including early fall. The absolute worst time is after the new leaves have emerged, when trees need the most water. You can ruin all that planning and preparation by being lazy and careful when moving and planting the tree. Start with a good hole and dig it before you dig the tree. The goal is to promote vigorous root growth. Generally, transplants will benefit from larger holes. Since most root growth occurs near the surface, making your hole wider, not deeper, is the best way to enlarge the hole and allow the roots to spread. The hole should be at least twice as wide and no deeper than is necessary to accept the transplant's root and soil ball. Recognize that when you dig a tree from the woods, you will be leaving behind many roots. The key is to retain as many as possible, but in the wild, they tend to be spread out and tangled with others. It helps to root prune in advance the year before by cutting the roots with a spade. Picture the circumference of the root and soil ball you will dig next year, and then sever the roots several inches closer to the stem than that. This will stimulate concentrated root growth in a compact area. Whether you root prune or not, dig as big a root and soil ball as is physically possible. Keep the ball together, maintaining root-soil contact, and keep the soil and roots moist. Don't expose the roots to sun and wind, and be careful not to break bark and branches. Use a tarp, a bucket, your coat, whatever it takes to keep that root ball intact, and use it to carry the tree. Don't try to lift the tree by the stem or branches. Work quickly. Now, the big moment. Put the well-chosen, well-lifted tree into the well-dug hole. Make sure any loose roots are spread down and outward. Position it in the hole at the same depth as it was growing in the wild. You should be able to see a color and texture difference between below and above ground portions of the tree. Backfill with the rest of the native soil you removed from the hole. Tamp the soil gently to firm the tree and roots in place, and then give it a good soaking with water. Do not add any fertilizer. If you must fertilize, wait until spring of the second year. You are not done. If you really want that tree to thrive, you have to care for it. Again, we're not talking about the intensive care unit, just reasonable care. Losing all those roots significantly reduces a plant's ability to absorb water and leads to real stress. Watering it well, especially during dry spells, is the best thing you can do for it. For spring plantings, water every day the first week, then once a week for the month, and maybe once a month throughout the summer. Mulching around the plant is another smart aftercare practice. It will help keep the soil moist, and it will reduce competing vegetation. It will also minimize chances of your transplant suffering the most common and deadly problems known to planted trees: weed whacker and lawnmower blight. Now all you have to do is be patient. It takes a few years for a tree to grow vigorously in its new site. But if you plant it well and take care of it, chances are your work and attention will pay dividends in the form of a successful and thriving tree. Pretty straight up. Green side up, brown side down. Didn't even need to write the rest of the essay, did I?
There you go. That reminds me of when we brought the Capitol Christmas tree from Vermont to Washington. And written on the bottom of the tree was "this side down." So, needed to tell those folks that in DC. And actually, Pat Leahy has that in his office as a table. They cut off that cookie from the bottom of the tree. It said this side down, and that's in his office. It was pretty funny.
What's next?
Okay, so a question from Eleanor. Sorry, back to tree pollination. Can you find pine seeds in pine cones?
Yes, if they haven't fallen out or been harvested by any number of critters that would like to eat them. So right inside that cone or at the base of each of those cones, scales is the location of a seed, which fall out, blow out, or physically rattled out. And in the case of some pine species, they actually are ejected out, opened by the energy of heat. So there's all kinds of strategies, but yes, inside the cones is where the seeds are.
Is there like a certain size tree that, I mean, you shouldn't try to transplant anything bigger than a certain size?
I think for like wildlings, it's saplings and seedlings. Seedlings are best. And so, definitely, you don't want to be, in my experience, I've had far greater success rate in trees that are smaller than me. I would say is a good rule of thumb. By the time, whatever species, if it's taller than me, its diameter is such that it's too much for me. It's too much to expect the tree to make it. So I look for trees smaller, again, vigorous. And another thing I didn't say here, but it often is a trick is to rebound, given you've lost so much root volume, you're bringing all of the above ground portion with you, is to do a little pruning above ground to bring that ratio of above ground to below ground a little closer to what it was, because you've now lost the below ground, a lot of the below ground. So principally starting by the lowest branches, maybe prune off the first whorl of a set of pine branches carefully. And any broken branches or damaged branches, perhaps you could maybe prune off, and that adjusts that root to shoot ratio, which is energetically a really important balance for the tree. And it's a cost to maintain. So you got a lot of above ground, no longer enough below ground. So reduce the above ground and give it a fighting chance to work through that.
So Eleanor wants to go back to the seeds to know if there's a best time of year to find them.
Yeah, sure. It's pine seeds that most do, they become mature, ripen, and are disseminated in the fall. And with white pine, you have a little bit of an advantage, is it takes 2 years for that to happen. So you can see the immature cones this summer, and you can say, oh, note to self, next late summer, early fall, I need to get out there and collect some of these cones, or maybe even before, if I can get them out of the tree, and then I can harvest the seeds out of those cones. The trick is to get them before all the birds and small mammals get to them.
So Rick says most trees or whips come as bare root stock. What are the benefits of seedlings with a root ball?
Well, that's the thing. If you're buying from a nursery and you're getting seedlings, they're going to be, bare root or not much. And whereas if you're going to go to, say, what I often look for is a place, say like the log landing on my woodlot, where it's not a place for trees to be for a long time. So I feel less guilt about digging them up there when after an operation, we put it to bed and then a bunch of things seed in, they grow. There's really nice pine and tamarack seedlings. I'll go out and just dig those up, drop them in a 5-gallon bucket, and then move them to where I want to plant them, because they're not going to be there. There's going to be another, landing there. So similarly, I think I encourage people to look at the rights of ways along town roads, yours, because they're going to come through and clear that right of way, any of the trees in there, and as they get up, they just don't have a future. why not give those trees, use those trees as your nursery and dig up seedlings there. And that's what I do. And again, when you do that, you get way more than you would in bare rootstock, except you're also shocking it. The nursery stock has been, produced for this purpose and has very good survival rates. I like given that everything else is working against it, I like the idea of bringing a little more soil with a wilding when you transplant it.
And so, Mike, who would give you permission to dig up trees along the roadside in your town?
Well, it would depend. It would be if it's your land. That's what I'm saying. Is if your road is along your land, they're your trees, but the town has an interest there, and they exercise that interest by mowing that. So it's just a place where trees will establish, but have no future. So why not look to those places to sort of rescue these trees and grow them somewhere else, because they're not, as opposed to stealing a tree from the woods somewhere where it has a good chance, right? So yes, it's about permission, assuming it's your own, then you're good to go. And if it's your neighbors, maybe ask. Okay. Yeah, stealing trees is not a good idea. Let it be known that the Woods Wise guy is not promoting the stealing of trees. We're not doing that.
Yeah, and I didn't even
This
think
is the night it all went horribly wrong, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't have any road frontage, so I wasn't even thinking that way. I was thinking more about, down the highway.
Right. Well, you want to be careful on that.
Yes, for sure. And so Rick also wants to know why you wait until the second year to add fertilizer, assuming you do not burn the roots with over fertilization when you plant.
Well, I think that's it. It's just too risky in my view to start messing with it. Keep the variables simple. You don't know what it needs, what's there, what's not there. It's just this assumption that if I fertilize it, everything will be better. You might just feed the insect problem that is on the underside of those leads that you don't even know about, and you've now just made it's a bonanza for that population. So it's just ease up. Do a great job of digging a good hole and a good site, making a good match, choose the right specimen. I mean, you're going to, and accept a certain amount of mortality, but to have that high rate of success, those are the things to focus on. And then, if you have a sense after year 1 or year 2 that the leaves are chlorotic, that they're yellowish, pale green, that's often an indication of a nutrient deficiency. And one that can be corrected with a soil amendment. And sure, respond to that. But you should not make an assumption that, well, dump a bunch of fertilizer in there, it's got to be better. Not necessarily. You may just be feeding its competitors. You may upset the kind of the chemical balance at a very tenuous time as it's sorting out this disruption and stress. So those are the reasons why I don't recommend it. You should never do it unless there's a reason to do it. You shouldn't do it on blind faith that it's bound to be better. It's potentially you're just polluting the soil and waters, and nobody wants to do that. It's well intentioned, but there needs to be a reason to do it for there to be any benefit. Otherwise, it's like throwing money on the ground that becomes pollution. That doesn't make any sense.
Interesting.
Al, you wouldn't do that, would you? Throw money on the ground?
How about some advice to get red oaks going from acorns?
Oh, nice. You have to kind of break them out of their dormancy and then coax them to germinate, to start them, which, this is true. I'm looking for, there it is. This is available online. Of course, I'm old fashioned, so I really like but this is a classic USDA Forest Service manual on seeds, and by every species, you just go by species and it'll tell you exactly how to pre-germination treatments, how to break dormancy, how to, basically how to raise up any seed. And so, because they have temperature and moisture regimes that you kind of put them through, and to make them kind of trigger the growth response. Think about that acorn is just waiting. It's waiting for certain conditions, and you need to try to provide them. And so seeds of woody plants in the United States, if you were to Google that now, I'm quite sure that this is available online. Just type in red oak or white oak, whichever you're working with, and you'll get written instructions, quite simple, on how to start a red oak acorns to plant out as seedlings.
Thank you.
Everyone's got one on the shelf, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and here's from David. He's thinking the same way I am. Along Interstate 91, can we take those little trees?
I wish. I can't advise that. No, just stay in your car, be safe, keep driving, get where you're going.
Yeah. That reminds me of Put Blodgett, who was bound and determined to clear the median strip of invasives, and twice was stopped by the police for being out there cutting invasives. So no, I guess they do not like that.
Not advisable.
Yeah. Another question from George. When should you use plant grow spikes? After the second year?
Yeah, I think, again, depending if it's indicated, sure. Feeding them that way through the kind of direct application in the soil by the roots. Yeah, after, year 1 or 2, I think that's reasonable to think you might start. But again, you might not need to if everything's going fine.
Thank you. Other questions, folks? No. Well, if you think of them, stick them in the chat box.
No question.
Okay.
How about one more? Shall I do
Moving on.
another?
Are you good?
I'll do another if you'd like. Okay. This
Okay.
next one is it's a little different, and it's what is DBH? What is DBH? DBH is shorthand for the diameter of a tree's trunk measured at breast height. Setting aside the interesting and potentially delicate follow-up questions the latter two words raise, let's first consider diameter. My geometry teacher told me it's a line segment passing through the center of a circle, the maximum distance from one point on the circle to another. In forestry, it gets more interesting. Because trees are solid and somewhat cylindrical, determining their diameters is not quite as simple as measuring a line across a circle. Still, diameter at breast height is probably the most common and important measurement made on standing trees. This is because it is directly measured, and so many other important tree attributes and values, things like tree growth, wood volume, and basal area, can then be estimated from it. Accordingly, every forester, ecologist, naturalist, and tree nut records the diameter of trees, whether their passion is wood or wilderness, or just measuring things. Because people in the natural sciences like to compare notes, they all refer to tree diameter as DBH, and they all make the measurements in much the same way. Clearly, if their results are to be comparable, their measurements must be specified and consistent. Given that all trees vary in size and form, it may seem odd that their diameters would be measured in the same way. But it is precisely because trees vary that a standardized approach is followed. For one thing, tree stems are not perfect cylinders, they taper. If given the assignment to measure a tree's diameter, I measure it at knee height and you measure it at eye level, I'll probably record a bigger number for that tree than you will. This is not good. Instead, to deal with the vagaries of tree form and terrain, all foresters, by convention, measure diameter according to a set of standard methods. And yes, even the wide range of breast heights has been considered, mostly. While there is some variation internationally, the standard method for measuring and reporting tree diameters is quite consistent. In the United States, DBH is the diameter of a tree stem measured at 4.5 feet above the ground. In Canada, Europe, and most of the rest of the world, metric DBH is measured at 1.3 meters, that's 4 feet, 3.2 inches. In Japan and Korea, it's 1.2 meters. And in New Zealand, it's 1.4 meters. There's more. As all good forestry students can tell you, DBH is also supposed to be measured on the uphill side of the tree from the duff, not the soil, perpendicular to the lean of the tree and above any branches, burls, swellings, or other protuberances that may exist at that height. What about forked trees, you asked? There's even a rule for that. If the tree forks below the standard height, measure each fork and call it 2 trees. If the fork is above the standard height, the fork doesn't affect the measurement. If the fork is at the standard height, you measure the diameter just below any enlargement caused by the forking. How and when did all this convention and agreement occur? And who decided that breast height is 4 feet 6 inches in the United States, but only about 4 feet 3 inches in Europe? Well, that's not so clear. Forestry is old. Methods have been developed for centuries. And while DBH is mentioned in the first American forestry texts as early as 1905, the idea of measuring girth at a standard height was well established in England, France, and Germany as early as the middle 1700s. And the term breast height was used in a German text in 1835. Even then, it was important to make the measurement in a consistent way at a standard point away from the swelling associated with the stump. Foresters, being a sensible lot, settled on the relative comfort of breast height. Let's face it, measuring at that height is easier than stooping, reaching, or climbing. And somewhere along the way, they decided that breast height was 4.5 feet up the stem, unless you're in Canada or Korea. Today, you have a choice of tools to use when measuring diameters. There are calipers, Biltmore sticks, and calibrated diameter tapes. It's also possible to measure the circumference, wrap a conventional tape measure tightly around the tree at 4.5 feet, and divide by pi. 3.14 is close enough to get diameter. Because tree stems are seldom perfect circles in cross-section, diameter tapes give the most accurate measures of diameter. They give the average of all possible measures and therefore are preferable for eccentric stems. By contrast, the Biltmore stick, while fast and easy, is the least accurate in most circumstances. But for most purposes, it's also quite close enough, and it's certainly fun to carry a big stick. I think it might be why I became a forester. When I saw the forester and the stick he carried around, it seemed pretty cool.
Why is it called a Biltmore stick?
Well, I think it was maybe developed at the Biltmore, which is an estate, and kind of one of
Carl
the,
Schenk.
yes, the professor of forestry early on, and it was sort of a home of early forestry, and I think that's probably where it was developed. Do you know more,
Yes.
Al?
Yeah, Carl Schenk at Biltmore, about 1905.
Thank you.
There's, there are many kinds of scale sticks, and we refer to kind of all of them as Biltmore sticks, when the Biltmore stick is actually a very particular scale stick. They're not all Biltmore sticks, but we tend to call them Biltmore sticks, one of those things.
Do they measure different things and that's why they're not all Biltmore sticks? Or is that
Yeah.
like a style or a certain?
Yes, because we've been focused on diameter, but there's also what's known as a hypsometer, which is on one edge of the stick, is using similar triangles, the Pythagorean theorem, the ability to use that vertically at a known distance, and you can calculate the height of a tree. So in addition to diameters, you can use it to measure heights. And then the scaling stick depends on whether you're scaling trees or scaling logs, in which log rule you're using to do that scaling. And so all these sticks have different configurations of diameter, height, volume, based on log rule. They have different size, lengths, different dimensions. So there are a variety of scale sticks, but the classic cruising stick in the woods is a Biltmore stick.
Okay. And Michael, would you explain for me basal area?
Sure. Yeah, basal area is quite simply the cross-sectional area of a tree at 4.5 feet above ground. So imagine that breast height measurement place, 4.5 feet on the high side, measured from the high side. If you were to just cut the tree off there and measure the surface area of that stump at 4.5 feet above the ground, that would be the basal area of that tree. And the foresters use the total cross-sectional area of all the tree stems on an acre as a measure of density, better yet, a measure of site occupancy, of crowdedness of that acre. We know that canopies overlap and intersect. So we use this instead as this, how much of the, if you were a bird looking down, how much of the acre of ground, 43,560 square feet of ground, how much of that ground is covered by tree stems? And that basal area per acre is a really, really powerful surrogate, and we use it to understand the growing space occupancy of the stand, how crowded it is, or how not crowded it is, and we use that as a basis for thinning, especially when we can tease apart how much of that basal area is in sugar maple or in pin cherry. You can tell, you learn a lot about, you kind of diagnose the stand's structure and development. It's a very key measure, basal area, and it exists at 2 levels: basal area per tree, basal area per acre.
Thank you. And so there is a number there that you're kind of looking for.
Number of square feet, it's measured in its area, so it's length times width, if you will. So it's the area as opposed to just the length or width. And right, it's how much of the acre is covered by tree stems.
Yeah, thank you.
And we use that relatively. We have stocking guides that help us understand the relationship between that number, basal area per acre, and the number of trees per acre. And you kind of want both, and you kind of optimize from there. It's it's fundamental to silviculture and is this measure of basal area. It's quite ingenious, actually, because you can measure it, indirectly and get very accurate estimates very quickly that are very powerful.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. How have DBH measurements changed over the past century for different species? So are trees getting bigger, smaller?
Well, of course, tree growth is an expression of their genetic capabilities, the environment in which they live. They're stationary in one place over time. There are changes in that environment that can be drought, it can be storms, it can be competition from other plants, it can be predation. So the ultimate expression of growth is, it's kind of hard to say by diameter, is this better or worse? Because so we'd like to think that over time, any given tree, its diameter is increasing, at least to a point. It's going to grow. But average diameter in a certain place over time, that's an interesting question. I think it depends on where and what stage of development and what's going on.
And another question from David: how accurate is a typical forester's estimate of basal area per acre?
Well, you can't trust foresters at all, right? Of course, we start with that, right? I mean, come on. If you lined all the foresters in the world up end to end, they still wouldn't reach a conclusion. Right. One of my favorite forester jokes. No, of course not. Wait, what was the question?
How accurate is a forester's estimate of basal area?
Well, it depends on how the estimate was made, and but it can be again, it's relatively easy to make a very quick and relatively accurate estimate. So we use you can measure it directly by measuring the diameter of every tree and adding it up, converting that to basal area, and then adding it up. Or more typically, we use kind of an indirect method of using a prism, which is like an ocular device. It's an angle gauge is really all it is. So a penny can actually substitute reasonably in a certain way to project an angle from your eye that starts narrow and widens. The idea being the farther away a tree is from you, as you're imagining that widening, the farther away from you the tree is, the bigger it has to be to exceed that angle. And any tree that exceeds that angle is a tree that you would measure, you would sample it. And if you know the dimensions of this angle and you do a few back calculations, you can establish it and use the right piece of glass to send an angle that is a nice round figure, turns out 10 square feet for every tree counted. And so that's really handy. If the tree is in your plot, in other words, it's worth 10 square feet, regardless of its diameter, even though we know bigger trees have higher basal areas, but it works out. So that's kind of this trick that we use. And I just told you like the world's fastest explanation of that ever, which is wholly insufficient, but it'll have to do. But that's how it works. And to answer the question, their estimates are pretty darn good. How's that? I'll call it pretty darn good.
So the prism actually gives you a sample.
It determines what your sample is. It tells you which trees are in your plot, essentially. It's kind of a variable. If you think of a plot, you're going to measure all the trees on a 10th acre. You draw a circle around yourself, mark that out and say, all right, all the trees in this 10th acre, I'm going to measure them. And then assuming it's uniformly distributed across the rest of the place, you'd say, well, then whatever I get, multiply it by 10, and that's the number per acre. That's one way. That's a fixed radius plot, a fixed area plot where you measure the trees in a known area. Prism sampling turns that on its head, and it's a variable radius plot. It allows us, there's no fixed width. We're using it to determine, based on this projection of an angle optically, which trees are in the plot or which trees are out of the plot. And all in trees count for 10 square feet of basal area. So you go around, you find you had 9 trees in your plot that were bigger than the angle. That means you have 90 square feet. Before you even leave the plot, you know what the average basal area per acre is in that plot. Because even I know that 9 times 10 is 90.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty ingenious, actually. When you kind of dig into like, how does this work? In fact, if you know how it works, you don't even need a prism. Like if you drop your prism, it breaks on you're crossing a stream and you drop it on a rock and it cracks. Actually, it's going to be a longer day, but you can just measure the trees and determine all this. And you can even estimate which trees are in because of it. Or you can pull out the penny and get a rough estimate. Still be pretty close.
Excellent. I've watched that done so many times and never really understood what I was seeing.
Most people don't. You're in a really, really big club.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Thank you for the explanation.
Sure. Happy to.
So, are there other questions, folks? We're winding down here. I know Michael has had a very long day. I'm not going to keep him longer than we need to, but
well, that's fine. I'm happy to do it. I was on Monday afternoon, someone said, how's it going? I said, well, it's been a long week. That was Monday afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah, and here it is Thursday night, so I'm sure it's been a really long week.
Well, it's been a long year for everybody. So again, happy to gather. Anybody who wants to talk trees, it's always great. Glad you're into it, and hope it's good.
Yep. So if there are no other questions, we're going to wrap up a few minutes early and let Michael go relax for the rest of the evening or do whatever else he needs to do before his day comes to an end. I thank you all for being here, for supporting Vermont Woodlands Association and joining us for these once a month talks. Invite your friends, please let them know we're doing this and have them hop on too. It's a great conversation.
Thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
See you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
See you next
Cheers.
month.
on the 3rd
Thanks.
of June.
Stay well.
Yes. Take care. Good night, folks.
Right.